Have you ever heard of an exercise snack or brain training that has nothing to do with Sudoku or crossword puzzles? Welcome back to the Exam Room Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Colleen Sloan. I'm a PA and dietitian, and I just have to pause here and do a little happy dance because today is my 150th episode of this podcast. How cool is that? I never thought this little passion project of mine would still be going on 2.5 years later. So thank you so much for being with me all this time. And if you're new here, welcome. So I would love an air high five, a virtual hug, or even better, grab a screenshot of you listening to this podcast, throw it in your stories today on Instagram, and tag me to celebrate my 150th episode. I'm really, really excited for this. So in today's episode, we're talking about cognitive health, but not just what to eat. We're getting into how food fuels the brain at a cellular level, why the unsexy, non-viral suggestions of eating fruits and vegetables remains an overlooked but highly effective mental health intervention. My guest also shares incredible lifestyle suggestions I'd never even considered before. Things like microdosing movement throughout the day, rethinking how we train our brain, and a completely different way to think about stress. One that might change how you counsel patients who feel constantly overwhelmed. So to guide us, I'm joined by Eric Collett. He's the founder of A Mind for All Seasons and a nationally recognized brain health expert who has spent over 2 decades helping individuals and clinicians improve cognitive, mental, and physical health. So if you've ever had a patient ask, what can I do to protect my brain? This episode is going to give you a whole new framework. So get comfy or drive safe and enjoy my conversation with Eric. Eric, I am so excited to pick your brain on this topic. Thank you so much for the gift of your time. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Colleen. I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, well, my first question is kind of a big one, but I want to start broad and then really get into the details of cognitive health and performance. And so in learning a little bit about you and what you do, I've seen that you believe that food is medicine when it comes to brain health. So I'd love if you can explain what you mean by that.
It's a great question, and it leads to an example that actually one of my colleagues had. He's a clinician. He acts as the medical director at our company. And several years ago, he had a father and son come into his clinic and sit down with him. And as he was finding out what was going on with him, the father said, well, my 17-year-old son here has attempted suicide 3 times. It's serious. We've been to multiple doctors. We've tried all sorts of different medications. We're coming up empty. And we were told that you're kind of the brain health guy. And what can you do? And so Randy spent like 45 minutes doing a really thorough intake and getting to know the situation. And toward the end of that, he said, tell me about what you're eating. And the young man looked at him, and then he looked at his dad, and he looked at him, and he said, well, I have Pop-Tarts and ramen noodles and mac and cheese. And Randy kind of looked at his dad, and his dad said, you know, it's a battle that we used to fight, and we just quit fighting it. He literally has a shelf in the pantry, and those are the 3 things that he eats. He has an occasional Big Mac, but that's it. And Randy kind of sat back, and he smiled, and he said, well, this might be easier than I thought. And this teenager looked forward and said, I'm pretty sure that's probably not a good idea. Like, what are you talking about? And Randy said, look, I'm not going to do anything with any of your medications right now. Keep taking whatever you're on currently. Keep seeing your counselor. But here's where I want you to start. Your high school is right next to a grocery store. And I want you to go to the grocery store at lunch every day, and you go to the produce section, and you pick one thing. I don't care whether it's a fruit or vegetable. Just pick one piece of real food and eat it. That's all I ask. And when you've done that for a few weeks, you come back and see me and let's talk. Well, a couple of weeks into it, he went to a counseling appointment, and the counselor said, something's different. And he said, yeah, this crazy doctor told me that I have to eat one piece of real food every day. And to her credit, she said, I think it actually might be helping you. I think you should do that at every meal. Well, to make a long story short, Colleen, he started doing that. And within 6 months, he was actually weaned off all of his mental health medications. He was back playing high school sports. And about a year later, Randy and his wife were at a volleyball game watching their daughter. And somebody came up behind them and sort of wedged in between the two and sat down. And it was this young man. And Randy hardly recognized him. He was happy. He was expressive. And he turned to Randy's wife and said, I love your husband. He saved my life because he taught me how to eat. Now, I don't think you or I would argue that starting to eat real food is going to be a fix-all for everybody with a mental health challenge. I would never say that. That would be irresponsible. But in this young man's case, he was nutrient depleted. And I think as far as a framework that this leads to, my view is that mental health challenges and cognitive health challenges are a metabolic problem. Cells are not producing good energy. And at a simplistic level, that means we either have a fuel problem, we have an electrolyte problem, or we have an exhaust problem, too much reactive oxygen species, or some combination of that. And so nutrition and getting those right micronutrients that are essential for producing ATP is really key to solving some of these challenges. And I think that's a good place to start in any of these scenarios.
Love that your colleague asked about nutrition because I feel like so many medical professionals have so many other things that they are thinking about that unfortunately nutrition kind of gets the backseat or even the trunk of the car, and it's often not even brought up or asked about. And I love that this is such a perfect demonstration of the power of nutrition. But Eric, I want to push back because there is a disagreement with the strength of the messaging of food is medicine. And there are some people who, will take the other end of the spectrum that say, well, if we promote this, then our patients might believe that they do not need medicine and they believe that food can heal all things. And a really good example would be possibly like cancer. And maybe they're going to say no to chemotherapy or radiation treatment in hopes that nutrition can heal them. So I would love your thoughts on that ideology and mentality. And what would you say in response to someone with that opinion?
So I think a good place to start is to recognize that every single situation is unique. And I don't think we're ever dealing with a single variable problem. I totally agree that food doesn't solve everything. There's actually a lot of other things beyond food. So I think people need to recognize that the deeper the toolbox and the more we understand the human body as a system of systems, and we appreciate the uniqueness of it and the complexity of what we're up against, the more we can help people understand that food as medicine is a tool in the toolbox. It's not the tool in the toolbox. That would be as silly as assuming that just because a hammer's wonderful at driving nails, that it's going to be good at putting screws in a piece of wood. It's not. There's a place for mental health medication. There's also a place for a lot of other tools in the toolbox, and we shouldn't neglect those either.
I love that response because I'm totally on board with that. I firmly believe in the power of nutrition, but in other modalities as well. So I think taking that stance can be helpful, but I love starting with nutrition. And a lot of patients are asking their clinicians about nutrition. So I really want to dig into your specialty, and that is cognitive health. So if a patient asks a clinician, what should I eat to protect my brain? I would love to hear what dietary patterns or eating habits are consistently linked with better cognitive health.
Yeah, I think the research is getting increasingly clear that ultra-processed foods are a disaster for human health. And so I think one place to start is the idea that if what you're going to put in your mouth was made by a chemist instead of a cook, it probably doesn't belong there. And that doesn't mean that we have to be ultra strict about it and that someone never eats a candy bar. But I think that when you look at papers like the 2022 paper in the journal Nutrients that really looked at a bidirectional relationship between ultra-processed food and mental health challenges, the links are becoming so clear. So a good place to start is helping people eat real food and appreciate the value of that and what it does for our bodies.
All right. So you mentioned ultra processed foods, and I have to talk about it because this is a very debatable and a hot topic, even amongst dietitians and some in my audience. I actually have a recent episode that I just recorded with a dietitian who looked at some studies about ultra processed food. And I want to just talk about the definition and that language there because the NOVA classification system is helpful, but it's not perfect. And so, when influencers say, avoid ultra processed food. And honestly, the messaging now that we're getting from our policy, from the new dietary guidelines that commercial with Mike Tyson that said processed food kills. Personally, I think that's a little bit of an extreme message for a lot of our society. I think it's a helpful message. It can be because I agree we should eat real food. But when you think about processed foods, yogurt can be processed. Oatmeal is processed, beans can be processed, right? A lot of things are processed. So I think if as a clinician we tell patients to avoid ultra processed foods or even processed foods, I think there needs to be some education there. So, Eric, when you tell me that ultra processed foods don't have a place in anyone's diet, can you please explain to me what you mean and which foods specifically are you talking about?
Yeah, I love where you're going with this because I couldn't agree more. It's totally different to eat something like yogurt. Um, and I would say there's, I think, a lot of variability between what kind of yogurt are you getting and what's
Right.
actually in it, what's been done to it.
Yeah.
But I would actually pull back a little bit and just say, this is why it's so important to have one-on-one conversations. They need someone to guide them and talk about their goals, their needs, where their health is, how they're running the engine, what kinds of foods they already love, and how do we build on successes as opposed to just making a blanket statement. I think if people are getting their advice from influencers, then it's just as problematic as people that go out there and spend truckloads of money on supplements. And when I ask them, well, why did you buy this thing? They say, well, I have this symptom, like I have low energy, and this supplement's supposed to help with energy. And at the end of the day, when you work through it, you find out, well, they've got undiagnosed sleep apnea, and that's really why they're dragging all the time. And that supplement has nothing to do with that. You got to do good work and listen to people and find out. And I think when it comes to nutrition, that's where I'd go with it. Now, coming back to your original question, what about ultra processed food? I think if you can look at the ingredients of something and you recognize those ingredients as real food and they're combined in a way that you might even cook in your own kitchen. Well, of course that food is processed, but that's different than food that doesn't even begin to resemble anything. There's no fiber in it. It sits on the shelf for months on end and it still is considered something that you could put in your mouth. And it's meant to look appealing from a visual standpoint, like fun. And it's got all these artificial colors and chemicals. That's one where I'd start raising my eyebrow a little bit more and saying, well, maybe we can find a better option than that. But again, it's kind of like the classic answer with dietitians where people say, well, how should people eat? And every dietitian I know says, well, it depends. Let's talk about you. And it's a nuanced conversation.
Yes, this is why most dietitians do not go viral on social media because the it depends answer really isn't sexy. So
Right.
I really love how you always bring it back to personalization and you cannot make black and white statements or just, a general recommendation for every person that you see. It really is personalized depending on so many different things. And, before we get into some of the specific nutrients or food groups, so many times we educate patients and we give them all of the facts and it can be really compelling information. But yet the patient doesn't seem to change and unfortunately can sometimes be labeled as non-compliant, non-adherent, and their health really suffers because of it. So there's that gap between education or information and then helping the patient apply it to their life. So you are really a superstar in this area. So I would love for some tips on how do we connect our education with the application in the patient's life.
Yeah. I love the question, Colleen, because I've seen the same thing that you've seen for years. For a long time, earlier on, before I had more experience, I would educate people about things that would be helpful. And in retrospect, I was really coming from the place of, at a high level, seeing how much benefit they would have if they would just make these changes. And I was just trying to convince them of what they needed to do. And I was, I think, kind of bludgeoning them with information. And over time, I developed a more nuanced approach. And I realized that I need to first understand their goal and what they're aiming for. And I need to listen a lot more. So I'll give you a quick example of how I navigate this kind of thing, because I had an experience just a couple of days ago that's really fresh with an experience. This is an older woman. She's in her, actually, she just turned 80. And she's amazing. She's a wonderful individual. She's very thin, about 125 pounds. She goes to the gym every day. And she came into a session with me and she said, Eric, I just feel so anxious all the time. And I'm not recovering well from my workouts. And I said, well, tell me more about that. What does that look like? Well, I go and I do this exercise class and we do some modest weight training. It's not anything crazy. And it's led by professionals at the local YMCA. It's a good class. But days later, I'm still sore. I'm tired. I feel like I'm just falling further and further behind. And I said, well, tell me how you're eating. And she was trying to eat a strict ketogenic diet. And she basically cut out all of her carbs, didn't do a lot to add in fats. So she was kind of in this middle ground where she was just totally nutrient depleted. And I wanted to just jump right toward saying, you need to eat more. It's going to help you. You're deprived. And instead I held back and I said, well, help me understand your goal. What made you choose a ketogenic diet? And she said, well, I read something that it can be helpful in improving ejection fraction, and I want to have a heart that works better, so I'm trying to do that. And I said, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Let's first celebrate that you're going to the gym. That's a win. Let's celebrate that you're eating real food. Wonderful. Let's build on top of that, though. And we were able to have a conversation about her goal and help her understand that if she's sagging and she's not working out hard, the lack of exercise and the ability that it's getting harder and harder for her to go to the gym is going to affect her ejection fraction a lot more than what she's eating. And she's just going to keep deteriorating. And I was able to talk to her about glycogen storage and how that works and how you replace that, and talk about the need to add some carbohydrates into her diet and to have a little bit more diversity and feed herself more because she's already thin. Anyway, I won't go through the rest of the details of the conversation, but long story short, she started eating differently. And my conversation with her a couple of days ago was a follow-up. She said, Eric, I can't tell you how much better I feel. The anxiety's gone. I'm recovering better. I just needed to eat more.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you start with a goal, it's a very different kind of conversation.
Very different. I totally agree with you. And it's so easy as a provider to want to fix it, right? We have that fixing reflex to just give advice because we have the knowledge and we know, quote unquote, what dietary pattern or food group they should be consuming more of. But really, I love that you took time to understand, like, why did you do this? I love asking, well, where did you hear about that?
Mm-hmm.
Was it from your doctor or was it from the mailman's brother's cousin who, was successful with weight loss and they told you to try it too, right? Like, where is this information coming from? What do you already know about that? Getting curious is so crucial to giving better advice, I would say. Okay, let's get into some nutrients because, my podcast is all about nutrition. And so from what you've studied and researched, are there particular nutrients or food groups that seem really important for brain health, especially as we age?
Yeah, 100% yes. For example, I think of the Oxford project to investigate memory and aging, Project Optima, run by Dr. David Smith. And he's demonstrated in multiple studies that if you address just a few factors, if you have optimal levels of your B vitamins, if your homocysteine level is less than 7, and if you have an omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio that's 4-1 or lower, over the long haul, that equates to 73% less brain shrinkage. Well, that's massive. And the research just keeps pouring out about things like B vitamins. There was a study in July of 2025 that really started examining more the mechanisms of those B vitamins and what they're actually doing to influence metabolic pathways that makes them so neuroprotective. And so as the understanding is developing, I'm seeing more and more research to support what I've seen from a practical standpoint, that you got to optimize B vitamins. Omega-3 fatty acids are critical for both gut health and brain health. We're talking about DHA making up roughly 30% of the structure of a neuron. So that's structurally significant. I see all the time that when we do blood tests on clients, typically they have 10 to 20 times more omega-6 fatty acids than omega-3s. And they're both important, but when you get skewed one direction, then you're in a really pro-inflammatory state and you're deprived of nutrients that are essential building blocks. And I see a big difference when you address some of those fundamentals. We often talk in the dietetics world and kind of the brain health world about magnesium deficiency. Lots of people are deprived of magnesium, not everybody. Choline, I think, is critical. We're talking about the building block of acetylcholine that's the key neurotransmitter involved in memory. And I think when people improve that dietarily and sometimes through supplements, they notice some measurable improvement. So I would say that those things are pretty key.
Okay, you mentioned 4 things I want to say, and I want to linger here a little bit because not everyone in my audience is dietitians. And so when you say things like choline, you're thinking, okay, great. Maybe they think of eggs, but I'm curious if we can walk through each of those and give us a few examples of foods that you would recommend for someone when you are talking about these things. So you had said B vitamins, omega-3s, choline, and magnesium. So if you can give us some examples of foods that are rich in these. And then you had mentioned supplements. So when do you think supplements might be appropriate?
Yeah. Maybe I'll go through that in the reverse order because I think a lot of people purchase supplements based on the outcome they want. I kind of mentioned that earlier. And I think sometimes people recommend supplements based on the outcome they're supposed to give. I think it's an entirely different thing to measure a factor and if there's a deficiency, replace it with supplementation and then remeasure and make adjustments. And I see a wide variability in people that our team has worked with in terms of how they're doing. So like D3, for example, I see some people that need very little D3 to have an optimal level. And I see some people that need 5,000 IUs a day. And I see some people that need even more than that because maybe they have a genetic issue or an absorption issue. So I think it's important to measure those factors. With B vitamins, I think it actually depends a lot on your methylation status. Somewhere around 30% of the population, it's estimated, has an MTHFR genetic problem. And so the enzyme that's converting cobalamin to methylcobalamin, for example, is sluggish. And I see all kinds of people that present with cognitive and mental health challenges, and they've got an MTHFR problem that's never been diagnosed. And when that's addressed, they tend to do better. Well, in situations like that, I think it affects how people eat. When it comes to things like magnesium, I'm a big fan of using a magnesium RBC test. I think it's more accurate than a serum mag. And I find lots of people that eat nuts and seeds, for example. That's one of my favorite ways that people can get magnesium. I love pumpkin seeds. That's a great source of magnesium. I don't have to supplement with magnesium because I've measured it and I get it dietarily. And I think that's the best way to get it if you can. I have some people, though, that really have a problem with magnesium. Maybe they've been on a proton pump inhibitor for years and they've got a malabsorption issue and it would warrant supplementing. As far as choline, eggs I really think is the easiest thing for a lot of people unless they've got an allergy in that department. And as far as omega-3s, certainly fatty fish, wild-caught salmon I think is a great source. That said, I find very few people when we do blood work who can actually have an optimal level of omega-3s by just eating fatty fish and, the few other dietary sources that are available. I think a lot of people probably do need to supplement that.
I love how you use the term thoughtful supplementation because I so agree with you. And so many patients, unfortunately, just see, what's on social media and they are promised the result that they want. And they're on so many supplements. And I'm like, goodness, we could spend this $200 and just buy you some more produce, some more nutritious foods, and you would probably feel even better. But there is an absolute time and place, like you had said, for thoughtful supplementations. All right, let's talk a little bit more about prevention. And so many of our millennial patients, their aging parents are unfortunately getting diagnosed with dementia, Alzheimer's, maybe even early onset dementia. And so we kind of have this like a wake up moment or sort of like that panic moment in our life where we're like, oh my gosh, I'm in my 40s and I don't want to, have dementia later on. So they might say, I want to reduce my risk of dementia, like starting now. What types of lifestyle interventions would you have them prioritize right now?
I think there's really a short list of impactful things. So one on the list is brain training. And most people think of brain training as Sudoku or crosswords. Our brains need novel cognitive experience. And there's lots of research on ways that you can apply that. But it could be as simple as you travel to a new place and don't rely on your GPS. Try to form mental maps or learn a new language or brush your teeth with your non-dominant hand or do some other activity with your non-dominant hand. That forces new neural connections. Exercise is phenomenal. If we could package up the benefits of regular physical activity into a pill, it would be the most stellar medication ever made. So I think people need to move, and often they make it way too difficult. People think that they just need to get to the gym. And sometimes I see clinicians giving advice to their patients like, Well, you just got to start exercising more. But people need to know how to do that. If you go to the gym for 30 to 60 minutes a day, and then you sit at a desk or on a couch the rest of the day, uh, that's better than not going to the gym. But in my opinion, that makes you an active couch potato, and the body is meant to move. And I think people get further and have better metabolic health if about once an hour they get up for 1 to 3, maybe 5 minutes, and they take an exercise snack. They use microdose exercise, and the possibilities are endless, and you don't have to go to the gym. You could march in place. You could do jumping jacks. You could do push-ups. You could go up and down the stairs, etc. You get the idea. But I find in clients that when they're given that kind of freedom and flexibility to just think more about movement, they do better. Certainly, diet plays a role. But as far as where to start the more nuanced conversation, clinicians have very little time, and they're doing the best that they can with the time that they have. And I think a good place to start is teaching people to ask the question, what have I hired this meal to do? What is my goal of eating this food? And then adapt based on how you're running the engine. If you went to the gym and you lifted weights for an hour, then you're in a very different metabolic state than if you've been sitting on the couch all day and not really doing anything. And I think we can learn to adapt based on how we're running the engine. If people learn to understand things like the role of insulin in our bodies, it's not just about glucose metabolism. Every tissue in the body has an insulin receptor, and hyperinsulinemia is at the root of things like heart disease and hypertension and Alzheimer's disease. And if people understand, and if clinicians start checking fasting insulin and then teaching their patients what things will improve insulin sensitivity over time and what they can do, like just understanding that when you combine fiber with carbohydrate, you're blunting the release of sugars. So you're going to get a better result. They start educating them on things like that, then they empower them to correct a root cause problem like hyperinsulinemia. Certainly, sleep is foundational to how the brain functions. And I personally think that everybody ought to be screened for sleep apnea. I've seen way too many very thin, frail women who you would never suspect of having obstructive sleep apnea. And yet, if you do a Mallampati score and just look at, well, how hard would it be to intubate them if they were in the emergency department and have them stick out their tongue when the back of their mouth is occluded because their tongue is so much bigger relative to the size of the mouth, they're actually at pretty high risk for sleep apnea. And if they've never been screened, especially if they live alone and nobody's listening to them snore at night, they could have a major risk factor that's completely preventable. There's certainly a lot more that could be said about sleep, but it's just critical. That's when the brain is taking out the trash and the glymphatic system is doing most of its work. Stress management is critical, and I think people forget that when your stress goes up in life, you can't always change that, but you can choose to counterbalance. And there are a lot of different possibilities that are really good ways to counterbalance stress. And then be social. These days, there's so much that's dividing us. And if I could tie that back into food, I think wherever possible, if people can prepare meals at home and carve out time and say, hey, this is part of my therapy. I'm going to experience the joy of making a meal, preferably with people that you love and care about, doing it together. And then I'm going to sit down and I'm just going to take some time to connect. I'm going to have a long meal. That is foundational for brain health. There's tons of research that supports the importance of those kinds of social connections.
There was so much to what you had just said. That was so rich. Thank you so much for that. But I want to linger a little bit because you teased us, and my listeners will be mad at me if I don't dig a little deeper in how we counter stress. Because, and I'm asking this personally, I would say, what are some of those exercises that you had mentioned? Because, yeah, stress is inevitable. We are all, working like crazy. Inflation is insane. We're also dealing with our relationships. Some of us are parents. So there's a lot of stress. So please share with us, how do you help your patients counterbalance some of their stress?
Yeah, it starts with a good conversation and finding out what their stressors are and helping people eliminate unnecessary stressors. For example, doom scrolling through social media and engaging in revenge bedtime procrastination That's adding stress that we just don't need in our lives. There are complex reasons why it happens, but often we can work through that and help people eliminate unnecessary stressors. But stress does happen in life. So what can we do? Well, for starters, gratitude and stress have an inverse relationship. If you're experiencing more stress in your life, an intentional practice of increasing your recognition of what you're grateful for will go a long way. Regular breath work, like every day and even throughout the day, taking some time to engage in things like box breathing exercises or Valsalva maneuvers even, can go a long way toward really prioritizing the parasympathetic response instead of just being in sympathetic dominance all the time. Sometimes people who are busy and have a lot of things going on are stressed because they have so many ideas floating around their head and they never close those loops. And the brain can really only hang on to about 3 things at a time. So the real problem at the root of that is people don't have a mental parking lot. There's too much going on. And years ago, I started carrying around a little notebook. And every time I think of something that I need to do or might need to do or might want to do, I dump it out of my brain. I just put it in that notebook. And then once a week, I go through and I sort of reprioritize and say, am I going to get rid of any of these things? Is this something that I really want to do? Am I going to do it this week? But I don't have to carry around all that mental burden because I've parked it someplace. We could go on, but the last thing I'd share with you as a practical place to start is to engage in a practice called scheduled worry. Every day, preferably toward the end of the day, sit down for just 10 minutes and brain dump every last thing that you are worried or stressed about on paper. And just write for 10 minutes. And when the timer goes off, you're done. And you take up that piece of paper, you wad it up and throw it in the trash. The whole practice is kind of like a trip to the gym. It's building mental resilience to sit there and to practice being stressed in the moment, but just dumping it out. And most people find that really cathartic. And over time, it takes about 2 weeks. That has a profound effect on things like insomnia, which is really, for most people, driven by anxiety. They're up at night because they're just worried about all this stuff. Scheduled worry goes a long way toward correcting that stressor.
That's absolutely brilliant. And I hadn't thought of it like that. We hear journaling and make checklists and things like that. I love that theory of scheduled worry. That's really, really brilliant. And I think that could be helpful for us as clinicians, to kind of brain dump whether you had really difficult patient cases or your kids were just driving you nuts, whatever you're stressing about, doing that at the end of the day. I think that's an incredible practice. So thank you so much for sharing that. All right. So my final question, I kind of want to loop it back now around to someone who maybe already has mild cognitive impairment. Maybe they do have early dementia signs. How would nutrition counseling change, or does it at all?
It does change. I think we have to look at root cause issues and consider, why is the cellular engine not working well? And that's a nuanced conversation. So I'll give you an example that is a twist that a lot of people don't think about. I had a gentleman come in years ago. This was like 5 years ago. And he had basically lost his friends and family. His wife of decades divorced him because he had gone from being happy and gregarious and a highly successful land developer to being rude and abrasive and accusatory. He was forgetting things all the time. She's like, I'm out. I can't take this anymore. He had become depressed to the point of suicidality, and he was also developing a tremor in his right hand that was pretty uncontrollable. He'd gone to his neurologist, who said, well, we're going to call it a Parkinsonism, and I don't have a lot to help you with. As we sat down and we really started digging into root cause issues and looking at what are the holes in the boat that are sinking your ship, we were led by listening to him about how he eats down the pathway of actually testing for mercury toxicity. And we don't do that with everybody. But when he got wealthy, he started eating ahi tuna sushi almost every day. And early on, we identified that he had a methylation challenge, which can affect your detox pathway through the liver. He also drank lots of alcohol. So we knew that he had some compromised liver function. And we were concerned that maybe there was some mercury related because he kind of acted like he had Mad Hatter's disease. Well, his results came back in a hair sample, urine sample, and serum sample. His mercury levels were in the 99th percentile. It took about a year of working with him to really slowly, carefully, methodically help him release that mercury and use binding agents to eliminate from his body. And I literally watched him go from being accusatory and aggressive and blaming me for anything that went wrong or any member of the team. It's like, if it went wrong, no matter he didn't follow instructions, it was all your fault. I watched him get his personality back. I watched the tremor go away. I watched his cognitive scores improve in objectively measurable ways. I watched him get his life back. He went back to his wife. She wouldn't have him back. She said, sorry, that ship sailed. But he got a girlfriend and he started traveling the world. And to this day, he checks in about every 6 months and says, hey, I'm still doing really well. That was a dietary approach, but it actually involved identifying something that was a problem for him personally and doing something about that. So I think it all comes down to what are the root causes affecting your ability to produce energy at the cellular level, and let's tease that out and figure it out.
Yeah, the work you do sounds so rewarding and is really truly fascinating. And like you had said earlier, is way more time than, your primary care clinician has, who probably has 10 minutes and they're already an hour behind, right? And so I would love for you to share kind of a little bit more about what you do and where people can connect with you online if they want to learn more.
Thank you. Yeah, primarily, the program that we offer to Mind for All Seasons it's education focused. We're helping people learn about root cause factors that affect their health. If people live in Idaho, then my colleague Randy is an Idaho licensed clinician, and we can dig even deeper and they can get a deeper level of health. If they live in other parts of the country, then often we have clinicians that we work with in other areas. But as far as my own personal work, a lot of it is just coaching people through lifestyle factors and even understanding biomarkers. A lot of people are even getting direct to consumer blood tests and they have questions about it. They don't understand what they're dealing with. And as an educator, I spend time helping them learn what that might mean for themselves and what kinds of questions they could take to their clinician to have a much more productive conversation instead of just showing up and saying, well, I Googled this thing, or I was talking to ChatGPT and it said this, and that never goes well with any clinician. So we try to empower them with better questions, more understanding so that they go prepared and they make the most of the short time that they have. And if people want to learn more about me or connect with me, I spend most of my time on LinkedIn if I'm on social media. So Eric D. Collett, Collett.
Okay, clinicians really appreciate individuals like you who can interpret those direct to consumer labs, because I can't tell you how many people sometimes come in with stuff and I don't even know. Like, I have to look it up because it's so random. It's just stuff that we aren't trained in traditional medical training. And so we really do appreciate when there is someone knowledgeable who can educate them and even give them questions or some guidance to come back to us. Because one of the fastest ways to shut down a clinician is for you to tell them, oh, chat told me it's XYZ and you need to order me this medicine or this lab. It's very frustrating for us. So if they can come with more education, more information, and really have that conversation, we will thank you. So I'm just so grateful for the gift you are to our medical community and to your patients. So thank you so much for the gift of your time and for being here today, Eric.
Thank you. It's been a fun conversation. I appreciate it.
All of Eric's contact information will be down below in the show notes, but thank you so much for being here and I'll see you next week.